Brother's spiteful party ruined my wedding, and parents showed up at 4 a.m. to harass me. I'm 31 and I got married just a few days ago. Unfortunately, my family didn't show up. My brother Derek wasn't even invited. That much was expected since we can't stand each other. But what really shocked me was that my own parents didn't attend, and the reason? At the very last minute, the night before my wedding, Derek decided to throw an over-the-top 28th birthday party. He had sent out invitations to all our relatives about a week before my big day, purely out of spite because he hadn't been invited. And it wasn't just some casual get-together. He went all out. He rented a huge venue, booked a live band, and even hired a stand-up comedian to perform. I can only imagine the catering and drinks must have been just as extravagant. While the entertainers weren't nationally famous, they were well known in the local scene, which meant the whole thing had to have cost him a fortune. When one of my cousins showed me the invitation, I felt a brief wave of paranoia. What if people actually chose to attend his party instead of my wedding? But in the end, my wife and I decided not to say anything. People had to make their own choices. Our wedding was set to take place in a hotel nearly 8 hours away from the city, making it impossible for anyone to attend both events. Still, we didn't want to influence anyone. We wanted to see what people would do on their own. Thankfully, every single one of our guests picked the wedding. Looking back, I feel a little silly for even worrying. A wedding is a major life event. There was no real competition between that and a birthday party. The only ones who didn't come were my parents. That was unexpected. Sure, we had a bit of an argument a few days before, but I never thought they would actually skip my wedding just to attend my brother's party. The argument had happened 4 days before the wedding. After my cousin showed me Derek's invitation, I called my parents, assuming they'd be on my side and maybe even talk some sense into him. Instead, they turned it around on me. According to them, this was my fault for not inviting Derek in the first place. They believed that since I had refused to let go of past conflicts, he had every right to be petty, and they weren't going to intervene. You're both adults, they said. It's not our place to get involved. That response made me pretty angry. I couldn't believe they were actually justifying his behavior when it was so obviously spiteful. In frustration, I snapped and told them that if they really thought what he was doing was acceptable, they might as well go to his party and forget about my wedding, and then I hung up. After that, I got busy with last-minute preparations and didn't try to reach out again. They didn't either. But despite everything, I never actually thought they would go through with skipping the wedding. I mean, this was a huge milestone in my life, their son's wedding. Then, the day before the ceremony, we sent a car to pick them up since they were supposed to travel with us. The car came back empty. The driver said he had rung the bell multiple times and even tried calling, but no one answered. I spent the whole day trying to reach them, but they ignored every single call. That's when I started preparing myself for the worst, that they might not show up at all. Even the next morning, just before the ceremony, I kept checking my phone, hoping they'd have a last-minute change of heart, but they never came. At that point, I had to accept it. It stung, but I refused to let it ruin my day. I was marrying the love of my life, and nothing was going to take that away from me. After the ceremony, I decided I wasn't going to chase them down or try to mend things. They had missed one of the biggest days of my life. That said everything. Then later that evening, during the reception, my phone rang. It was them. I answered out of pure curiosity, wondering what excuse they'd come up with. What they said left me stunned. They told me they were only following my instructions. I had told them not to bother coming, so they hadn't, but despite that, they still wanted to congratulate me. At first, I assumed they meant for the wedding, but no, they were congratulating me for getting my way. Apparently, no one from the family had gone to Derek's party. Not only that, but many relatives had actually called or texted him to lecture him about his behavior. According to my parents, this was all my fault. They were convinced I had deliberately turned everyone against Derek. They said he had been expecting a huge crowd, but instead, only a handful of people showed up. Mostly just his friends and coworkers. He had wasted a ton of money, and now he was furious. And instead of holding him accountable for his own actions, my parents decided to blame me. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of the reception to talk to them properly. I told them exactly how I felt, that I was deeply hurt by the fact that they had chosen to skip my wedding over something so trivial. And now, instead of showing even a shred of remorse, they were calling just to taunt me for winning some imaginary battle. It was unbelievable. I was furious. I really let them have it. I tore into them for everything. How they had treated me, how they had chosen to support Derek's petty antics, and how they had the audacity to call me insecure, when all I did was try to celebrate one of the biggest days of my life. Their response? They told me they didn't care what I thought. In their minds, I was just jealous of my brother. And that was the real reason I was acting like this. That was the last straw. I hung up, blocked them, and went back inside determined not to let them ruin the best day of my life. I had just married the love of my life. I wasn't about to let a couple of bitter people drag me down. A few days later, when things settled down, I realized that a lot of people had questions. Everyone wanted to know why my parents hadn't attended the wedding, because they couldn't believe they would actually skip such an important event just to go to Derek's party. So, I decided to clear the air. I sent out an email to all the guests, laying out everything in detail: Derek's last-minute birthday stunt, the argument I had with my parents, what I had told them about not bothering to come if they really thought Derek was in the right, and finally, the argument we had over the phone during my reception. I didn't hold back. I told the whole truth, just as it happened. And now, just like that, the rest of the family is cutting them off. Of course, my parents are blaming me again. Apparently, I'm the one creating drama and being petty. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am being a little petty. But if I am, I think it's completely justified. So, am I the bad guy for telling everyone the real reason my parents skipped my wedding? Edit. Since a lot of people have been asking about my history with Derek, here's the deal. There's no single incident that caused us to dislike each other. Even as kids, we were never close. As we got older, we grew even more distant. He was always a little jealous, always copying me, and it got on my nerves. By the time we hit high school, we just flat out didn't like each other. Then I moved away for college, stayed for work, and only visited home occasionally. But every time I did, he would take cheap shots at me, mocking my appearance, my salary, whatever he could find. Eventually, I realized there was no point in engaging, so I started ignoring him completely. Once he saw that I wasn't going to take the bait, we just stopped speaking altogether. At family gatherings, we acted like the other didn't exist. No major blow-up, no dramatic fight. Just years of things going sour. That's why I didn't invite him to the wedding. I don't think I did anything wrong. Honestly, I doubt he even expected an invitation. If he did, that would have been completely unreasonable. As for my parents, they've always known about our strained relationship. In the beginning, they tried to fix things, but when that failed, they gave up. They never really took sides. That's why their recent behavior shocked me. Suddenly, they were completely biased toward Derek, which had never happened before. But hey, it is what it is. Nothing I can do about it now. Update 1. First off, thanks to everyone who commented. It feels good to hear that I'm not crazy for feeling this way and that I have nothing to apologize for. Since sending out that email, my inbox has been flooded with messages from my parents. Every single one has gone straight to the trash. I've blocked them everywhere. If they want to keep making new accounts to try and get to me, that's on them. I'm not changing my stance. Besides, it's not like I spread false rumors or exaggerated anything. I simply told the truth. If the rest of the family decided to cut them off because of it, that's their choice, not my problem. And honestly, my parents already accused me of turning everyone against Derek on the day of the wedding, so in a way I just did what they had already blamed me for, except I did it honestly, not in some underhanded way like Derek. Speaking of underhanded, my cousins and a few relatives showed me an email my parents sent out in response to mine. In it, they painted me as some jealous, insecure older brother who always had it out for Derek. They admitted that he threw his party last minute, but according to them, it was only because I had gone out of my way to make him feel bad first. Apparently, they even made up a whole story about how, after I sent out my wedding invitations, I called Derek just to rub it in his face that he wasn't invited. According to them, I told him that my in-laws come from a well-off family, and that he simply wasn't good enough to make the cut. Apparently, I had also told Derek that I didn't want anyone to know he was a good-for-nothing freelancer. Obviously, I never said anything remotely close to that. Anyone who knows me well wouldn't believe such nonsense for a second. That's why I haven't even bothered to defend myself. There's no need. Their lies are so ridiculous that no one is taking them seriously. What's actually funny is how desperate they are to make me look like the villain. Instead of taking responsibility for their own actions, they've resorted to fabricating stories just to salvage their own reputation. But in doing so, they're only making things worse for themselves. I don't understand why they're so hellbent on painting me as the bad guy. Especially when, aside from sending that email, I haven't done anything to them. None of this makes any sense to me. But you know what? I'm done with it. This chapter is closed. I have way more important things to focus on, like enjoying my time as a newlywed. These moments aren't going to come back, and I refuse to waste them on their drama. They can drag this mess out all they want, but I'm not playing along anymore. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update, and last night my parents and Derek tried to ambush me with a conference call. They used burner numbers, so I didn't recognize them at first, but it wasn't hard to figure out who it was. I was home with my wife when my phone rang. I debated ignoring it, but honestly I was in the mood to mess with them, so I picked up, and let me tell you, I had my fun. For the first 5 minutes, I pretended I couldn't hear them. Every time they tried to talk, I'd go, "Hello? Hello? You're cutting out." Just to mess with them. It was hilarious because despite calling with the intention of yelling at me, they had to stop and troubleshoot their connection first. By the time they got around to actually saying what they wanted, I had already won that round. Finally, they got to the point. They told me that the rest of the family had cut them off, that everyone was mad at them, and that they were being seen as petty and childish. Apparently, their attempts to smear me had completely backfired, and now they expected me to fix it. I played along, pretending to be concerned. "Oh no, that sounds terrible. What do you want me to do?" As if I had the slightest intention of helping. Naturally, they assumed I was being sincere. They said we needed to put out a statement, another email, saying that we had sorted things out as a family, forgiven each other, and moved past everything. According to them, that was the only way to restore our family's reputation. As, God forbid, they become the subject of gossip. At this point, their desperation was so obvious it was almost sad. They weren't interested in making amends. They just wanted damage control. The whole thing was a pathetic attempt to save face. That's when I dropped the act. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that their reputation was the only thing at stake here. Not mine. People still liked me. I hadn't spread lies. I hadn't abandoned my family for a birthday party. The damage was theirs to deal with, and I had no reason to pretend otherwise. I also had a big problem with how they phrased everything, especially the idea that we had forgiven each other. That wording implied that I had done something that required forgiveness, and that was not the case. They were the ones who made their choice. They were the ones who doubled down. Everything that happened after that was a consequence of their behavior, not mine. Besides, after all the lies they had spread about me, there was no way I was going to play along just to make them look good. So, I made it crystal clear. I wasn't interested. If they wanted to keep being mad, spreading nonsense, and hoping someone might believe it, they were more than welcome to. Of course, that sent them into a rage. My parents were fuming, but Derek was the worst. He started yelling, saying that everything was my fault, that if I had just done the decent thing and invited him to my wedding, none of this would have happened. For a split second, I felt bad, but then I reminded myself, this was my wedding. I wasn't obligated to invite anyone I didn't want there, especially someone I barely had a relationship with. He knew that. So I told him straight up, if you wanted to be invited, maybe you should have treated me like family before now. That set him off. He called me petty. I called him delusional. He tried to argue that he had never invited me to any of his events because they weren't as significant as a wedding or an engagement. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had never been kind to me, never made an effort, and yet somehow expected an invitation. That was his problem, not mine. At some point, the whole thing turned into a screaming match. Derek was screeching. My parents were shouting over each other, and I couldn't even make sense of what they were saying anymore. So, I did the only sensible thing. I hung up. Then I blocked their burner numbers too. I don't regret answering the call. It was entertaining for a little while, but by the end, it was just exhausting. So if they try again, I won't bother picking up. I'm done. Update 3. It's been a couple of days since my last update, and this morning, at around 4 a.m., my phone started buzzing. When I checked the screen, it was another unknown number. I didn't pick up because at 4 a.m., I was almost certain it was either Derek or my parents calling. There was no way I was getting dragged into a mess that early in the morning, especially with work just a few hours away. But about half an hour later, things escalated. Suddenly, we heard shouting outside our house, followed by the doorbell ringing nonstop and loud banging on the door. It took my wife and me a moment to process what was happening, but soon enough, we recognized the voices. It was my parents and Derek. They were yelling for us to open up, claiming they needed to talk to us because I was ruining their lives. Apparently, the rest of the family had completely cut them off, and in their minds, that was somehow my fault. Had this happened during the day, I probably would have just been annoyed, but at 4 in the morning, I was absolutely furious. Aside from everything else, you can't just harass people like this, especially not in the middle of the night. They were loud enough that I was sure our neighbors could hear everything. Though no one said anything later, they were kind enough to pretend nothing had happened. But I knew they'd been disturbed, which made the whole thing even more embarrassing. At that point, I didn't hesitate. I called the cops. My wife and I stayed in bed, letting them scream themselves hoarse while we waited for the officers to arrive. We were both exhausted and beyond done with their nonsense. When the cops finally showed up, we explained the situation, and my parents and Derek were removed from our property, but by then we'd already lost so much sleep that we had to take the day off work. Missing an entire day because of their antics was incredibly frustrating. After this, we've decided that if anything else happens, we'll be filing for a restraining order. Moving or changing numbers would be too much of a hassle right now, but taking legal action seems like the best option. We're going to consult a lawyer and see what can be done. Update 4. It's been a couple of days since that ridiculous early morning stunt, and we spoke to a lawyer the same evening, since my parents and Derek were just trespassing and causing a disturbance, but hadn't actually harmed anyone or damaged anything. They were let off with just a warning for disorderly conduct. No charges were pressed. However, the good news is that we do have grounds for a restraining order, so we moved forward with it. Today they were officially served, and in a few days we'll be appearing in court to put an end to this mess once and for all. I've already spoken to a few family members about everything that's been happening. There's no point in keeping their behavior under wraps anymore. The irony is that my parents and Derek never even cared much about the rest of the family before all this. They were never the type to be deeply involved in family gatherings, and Derek barely spoke to anyone, so them being cut off shouldn't even affect them as much as it supposedly has. At this point, I don't think this is even about the family at all. It's just about them trying to stir up trouble for me. That's the only explanation that makes sense, but if that's what they wanted, I hope they're satisfied, because the only people they've managed to screw over are themselves. Now they have to deal with the consequences of their own actions. It's actually sad. All this drama could have been avoided if they had just acted like normal, reasonable people. Instead, they went out of their way to embarrass themselves, and by extension me. I'm not happy about filing a restraining order against my own family, but at this point there's no other choice. The whole situation is just pathetic. Update 5. It's been 4 weeks since my last update, and the 2-year restraining order against my parents and Derek has officially been granted. That's a huge relief. The rest of the family has stood by me throughout this, but now they've gone a step further. Not only have they completely cut off my parents and Derek, no invitations, no communication, but they've also been checking in on me more often, making sure I'm doing okay. Most of the time I feel fine, but there are moments when I can't help but think about how sad it is that things reach this point with my own family. Having their support means everything to me, though I feel especially close to my cousins since they've been there for me in every way possible. Emotionally and practically, they even helped me find a good lawyer. I don't think I'd trade this kind of support system for anything. Now, I think it's time to finally start a fresh chapter. My wife and I are leaving for our honeymoon in a couple of days, and when we return, I hope things feel different, lighter. A change of scenery is exactly what we need, and I'm really looking forward to it. For the next week and a half, I refuse to let anything related to my parents or Derek cross my mind. They already tried to ruin my wedding. I won't let them ruin this too. With that said, thanks to everyone who has followed along with this situation and offered support. I truly appreciate it. See you around.